Welcome to the Suffolk Walking Festival podcast, where we guide you around the footpaths and bridleways of Suffolk to discover what makes this county so very, very special. I'm David Falk, the director of the Suffolk Walking Festival, and in each episode of this podcast, I'll be meeting someone who shares our passion for walking in Suffolk. In today's episode, I walk with Dr. Mike Brock, who is an associate professor and lecturer in economics at the University of East Anglia. We meet at Brandon Country Park. Mike, thanks so much for meeting us and for joining us on the Suffolk Walking Festival podcast. Now, you're an associate professor of economics. Tell us more about your role.
So my title is a lecturer in economics, but my research area is environmental economics. So I look at different behaviours of people and how you might use behavioural economics to try and get people to act in a more sustainable way. And thinking about getting people active and get out into the countryside is just one of those areas that I've been researching in, and looking at the overlap between how people make choices and how they might make choices that would lead them to do more of this sort of stuff.
It's interesting because people think of economics in purely financial terms, don't they? They think of economics in terms of the stock markets and money and cash and so forth. But this is a very different field of economics, isn't it? Behaviour economics. So it's looking at people's attitudes, behaviours, and there's something called nudge sort of theory, isn't there, where we're trying to nudge people to do certain things in a different way, and that's where you really focus.
Absolutely. So I've been in economics now for around 15 years, and I think my family still expect that I'm going to go to London and work in the city at some point.
It's not tempting you then?
Not whatsoever. Not at all.
You wouldn't replace Canary Wharf with here, would you?
Definitely not.
No.
It's beautiful out here. Don't think you get that in the city.
No.
So you're absolutely right. So behavioural economics is a branch of economics that is trying to understand how people make real choices and then align that with what economic theory predicts in terms of how people make choices. And when there are differences between those two things, trying to understand what it is that creates those differences. A nudge is an area of behavioural economics which is trying to understand how you might change the frame for people, trying to understand how actually if you word something differently or you provide them with information in a different way, whether that can lead to adaptations in behaviour that might work out better for them or better for society. And obviously there's a really close link there with the environment and trying to make sure that you give people information in a way that maybe makes them think differently about the environment, and in this case perhaps maybe getting out into the fresh air and walking and how that might be better for them in the long term.
Now, we're sitting interestingly at Brandon Country Park, and I should explain that you and I know each other quite well because I used to manage the country park and you were also doing research here, and you were doing research in trying to understand why people visited the park and how they walked around the park, and we used to use that research to try and develop our information for visitors and encourage them to see more. We learnt a lot in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we've known each other many years now.
Yes.
Unluckily for you, David.
I was just saying, we haven't changed at all, have we?
No, exactly. haven't aged either. It's been great.
You still look good. It must be the outdoors. Yes.
And over that time, we ran a set of research projects, largely with students on internship projects, and tried to understand what it is that makes people come to somewhere like Brandon Country Park, but also what might be preventing people coming here more often, or maybe even coming here at all. And understanding those kind of barriers for people is a really major aspect of then thinking about, well, how do we have to change the information they have about getting out into the countryside, and then maybe make them rethink whether it's something they can do or want to do.
I think it's interesting because sometimes what you think will engage with people or help them get out and about doesn't always work.
I think it's always very difficult to try and assume that everybody is capable of coming to a place like this or going for a walk, and instead you've got to sort of take a step back and think, well, why might it be that somebody is put off walking? What kind of aspects of getting out in the countryside are scary for people,
Yeah.
or actually a physical barriers preventing them doing so, and then thinking, well, what can we do to try and address those barriers?
And it's right what you say about sort of trying to address those barriers, because sometimes you don't know those barriers are there. You know, if you have your own personal experience of when you were young going into the countryside, it feels very familiar going out and about. And I was reading something just recently that if you've been out and about in the countryside before the age of 12, you become very accustomed to going to the countryside. If you delay that experience until you're after the age of 12, you carry these fears and these concerns about being in the countryside, and they stay with you. You're not ready set, as it were, to just go for a wander in the woods and enjoy it. So it seems if you've experienced it when you're young, it helps.
It's absolutely true. So I grew up in the Forest of Dean. So I grew up in the West Country. And whenever we come and meet here, I always park outside of the park and walk in, and it's just so reminiscent of actually spending time as a child out in the countryside, and the kind of those sights and sounds. And yeah, I think it's true. If you haven't experienced that when you're young,
Yes.
it's perhaps much harder to have the incentive to start going out into the countryside again, you know, for the first time when you're an adult.
I mentioned I was working here at Brandon Country Park, and we put on lots of events when I was here. We had all kinds of activities and big events. We had a folk festival and all kinds of things. And I remember the audience who I sort of almost gave up trying to attract to the park, because it was just so hard to attract them. It was the teenage audience, because I guess they're very distracted. And then I do remember one evening coming out after the end of the day working, and I looked up the visitor centre, and I turned around and there's all these teenagers sort of milling around the park. And I knew some of them because I was a governor at the local school. I went up to them and said, what are you guys all doing here? And they were playing Pokemon. And it just made me really realise that there are some barriers to countryside access, and then there are some things that get people into the countryside. And Pokemon actually, in a weird way, did it for an audience that I was really struggling to attract. And one of the reasons they were coming here was because, and I've never played Pokemon, but there was a Pokemon gym at the base of the giant redwood tree. But it was interesting how that gamification, as they call it, was appealing for the kids. They weren't going for a walk in the countryside, they were going on a Pokemon exploration. And it was interesting how that drew them out into an environment like this, which is really powerful.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing there is that, you know, Pokemon was the one that everybody now knows is getting people out into the countryside. But since then, I think the way that the kind of apps and technology work, there are probably a whole host of similar types of activities that people can now engage in and do, that are like that. But you're right, their main intention wasn't let's go for a walk in the countryside, but that's where they've ended up as a consequence of actually taking this activity on.
Mike, we were talking there about why people don't go into the countryside. Talk to me a bit more then about those barriers, to call them that, those physical and psychological barriers to why people perhaps wouldn't explore the woods or the countryside maybe in the way that you and I would do.
There's lots of parts to that, right? And some of it is a much more practical set of barriers. So there are people who they may have a reason why they can't get access to the countryside near them. Maybe the public transport doesn't allow them to, and they don't have their own private transport. But I think for a lot of people, the bigger barrier and the thing that perhaps could be addressed is some of these more psychological barriers that there are to getting out into the countryside. And the research that we did over the years has shown that a lot of that is to do with fear of the unknown. And that's in a variety of ways. It can be kind of a fear of, well, I don't know exactly where I'm going to be going. You know, part of the appeal ought to be that you can almost get a little bit lost in the woods, and that's quite nice. But for a lot of people, that's really quite scary. A fear of what else is out there. Am I going to end up in a field and there's going to be a bull or some cows? And
that's one of my fears.
And I think the other thing, particularly for families, in economics terms, we call it the opportunity cost, right? So you would say, well, we've got a Saturday free, what should we do? And you worry about, if you aren't used to going out to the countryside with the family, you think, oh, well, what about if they don't have a good time? And yet we know we could have gone to the cinema, or we could have gone bowling, and they like doing that.
It's interesting you say that about the opportunity cost. When we planned big events here, we sat down and thought long and hard which day of the week would we have the event. and we would often go for a Friday during a half-term or holiday period. So for example, in the summer holidays, we'd often do a big event on almost the last Friday of the school holidays. And the reason we chose Friday was because we thought there was too many other things going on Saturday. There could be football, shopping, whatever else is going on. But on a Friday, people would be more free. And the other way we thought was, by the end of school holidays, you've had your break, you've gone abroad, and you've come back, and you're kind of searching for something to do at the end of school holidays. And it worked. We had so many people come here. We broke all records, in fact. We had over nearly 1,500 people, which is quite a lot of people at Brandon Country Park. We had 1,500 people wandering around the site doing all kinds of activities and events here as well. So that sort of competing stuff is quite interesting. Why people choose one thing over another.
Absolutely, and I think people often on their weekends, they get very stuck into routines. So also my sister's got 2 young children, and it's, on Saturday we do this sport, and then in the afternoon we go swimming, and it's like, you haven't really left yourself much time in the day to go and do something. And you're right, then organising an event in the holidays midweek when you're breaking that routine, I think is a great opportunity, and actually that might be the thing that makes people rethink, we did that as a one-off, maybe we should try and either substitute some of the things we're currently doing on our weekends, or at least weave it into doing it a little bit more often.
As the norm. When I grew up, our entertainment at the weekend was basically going up an old railway line into a golf course and playing around in the woods, basically. So that was it. So there was much more freedom, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I can very similarly. I don't think we had the structure of we do this club at this time and this club at another time. We were much more a case of off you go and play out in the woods and enjoy yourselves and entertain yourselves in that sense.
One of the appeals of the Suffolk Walking Festival is the fact that it is guided walks, and so people don't have to worry about getting lost. And I know from just anecdotally talking to people on the festival that some people aren't very good at map reading, for example, so they don't really want to go off on their own because they're not quite sure if they're going to turn left when they should turn right, or turn right when they should turn left. So that helps very much. What are the ways you can counter that, do you think, then? How do you sort of address that with people if their fears are of getting lost on the route or not finding somewhere? How do you address that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it can come down to kind of what we would call standard framing, right? So it's about the information that they feel they have to hand before they're going to actually come and do this. So maybe it is that, take for example Brandon Country Park, on their website they have a very clear kind of indication that there are routes you can do which you could access if you were in a wheelchair, for example.
Yes.
So it's not, these are going to be difficult terrains to be able to cover. There are routes that would take the average person 20 minutes.
Right,
so people know that this isn't going to be, I'm going to start off at 10 a.m. and I'm still going to be out here when it gets dark and we're in the middle of June.
Heading towards Norwich.
Exactly. And the other things that can really be done, and we've kind of touched upon this, can be having a big event where lots of people are at the site, and you get a chance to kind of have a taster of what it's like to be at somewhere like this, or at a park out in the woods, and realise it's not actually the scary wilderness that you've never known, and you think, well, no, we could come back here again.
The beauty here, of course, is that we can just sit behind you. There's a cafe, there's toilets, there's parking, and there's benches and seating everywhere. So it makes it very easy for people to visit and to enjoy this with a degree of I suppose, assurance that they're not going to get lost. Although that did happen at times when I was the manager here. There was more than one occasion I had to go out and find someone based on some very sort of vague description of where they were. There's a tree to my left, there's a tree to my right. Okay, there's a lot of those, but we did find them in the end. should just say for people listening that they might hear a rumble in the background. We're a couple of miles from Lakenheath Air Base, where they have the American base and their fighter jet, which are quite impressive, but they're quite noisy as well.
Yes, it's you certainly get a contrast, right, between the bird song on the one side and then a great big roaring jet coming over.
Well, the interesting thing, having worked here, is that the air base and the sound of the jets doesn't put off the wildlife. The wildlife here is thriving. There's a large population of gold crests that live here. There's some incredible mandarin ducks that live on the lake and so forth. So it's a really interesting place for wildlife here. And I used to come out to the office at about 6 p.m, 6:30, and I would hear tawny owls from all different directions. It was just magical. Mike, for a lot of people, they don't always have the luxury of having a country park right outside their door almost. We're literally on the doorsteps of Brandon town itself, so this is a fantastic resource. Some people live in very urban locations, and there's a difference, isn't there, between an urban walk, which is still exercising, it's still doing cardiovascular work, and doing the same sort of activity in a rural environment. They're quite different, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to proclaim to be a psychologist here. I'm going to bow to somebody who definitely has done this. But there was some research done by Kaplan on what's sort of looking at the overlap between nature and the ability to restore your attention.
Okay.
And what they have essentially said is that spending time out in the countryside, out in nature, has the potential for you to be able to essentially recharge your batteries, is the easiest way to describe it. And so what they sort of said is that there are lots of stages to this. In the first stage, you're able to clear your mind of things that have been kind of worrying you. You are able to recover from any mental fatigue that you've been undergoing. And then they say there's this aspect called soft fascination.
Okay, what's that?
Which is essentially where you can start to take in your surroundings, but you're doing so in a very reflective way. So it's not like when you're in an urban environment and you're kind of having to cross the road and you have to look both ways, hopefully, and you're then looking at all the different shops and that kind of thing. So you're taking things in, but it's in quite a stressful kind of way.
Because lots of competing sounds and noises.
Exactly. Whereas the kind of attention that the countryside allows you to absorb is very kind of almost kind of subconscious.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it then allows you to have room for general reflection and recuperation.
Right.
So a lot of people and a lot of scholars and a lot of research has shown that spending time outdoors can be really good for, if you like, alleviating a lot of the stresses that we have from day to day in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps at over the last year or so with the pandemic, that's also been very true for people. It's been a great way for them to shake off some of the concerns or anxieties they've had, because when you're walking out in the countryside, things are so simple, and you don't have to think about anything else except listening to the sound of the birds or the sound of the wind through the trees. And for different people, they hear different things.
I love it. You said the wind through the trees, and as you said that, the wind went through the
I know,
trees.
that was perfect, wasn't it? I can't guarantee that would ever happen again.
If you could just say the sun comes out, that would be
exactly.
really good.
Yeah, and it becomes 35 degrees and sunny.
Because it's quite cold today, but yeah.
But no, it's a really interesting area of research that is kind of a blend of psychology and environmental studies that have really shown some of the human benefits to spending time outdoors, and particularly in a rural environment.
And it's called soft fascination and hard fascination.
So the urban kind of concentration that you have to take in, if you like,
Yes.
or the way you think about things in urban settlements is known as hard fascination.
Okay.
And that's basically, the hard fascination doesn't give you the room for the kind of reflective element of your thought processes.
Yes.
But that is something that you do get with soft fascination, or the kind of attention that you give the rural environment.
I read recently also a really interesting piece of work that was talking about how we have a desire to be in the countryside naturally in us, because that's where we came from as hunter-gatherers. If you go back thousands and thousands of years, you know, as humans, we started off not living in urban concentrations. We started living off in sort of small communities in the countryside. So we have this sort of inbuilt ability to enjoy the countryside. And what I was reading was that evolution hasn't really caught up with our change in lifestyle. And they talked about something called human mismatch theory. And the theory being that our evolution is still imprinted in us to live in the countryside, but we're not doing that anymore. We're now living in urban areas, but we're not really evolutionarily, if that's the right word, adapted for that environment. It's quite an interesting idea.
A very interesting similar area, which is closely linked with the behavioural economics, is what's known as the intention behaviour gap. So people want to get out and be out in the countryside, and they say, well, I'm going to do that, you know, X number of times a year, or I'm going to make sure I do it more often. That's what people normally say. I'm going to do that more often. And then they don't. You know, so I'll do it the next week, or I'll do it at some point.
They put it off, really.
They put it off.
Right, yeah.
And really, I mean, if we think back to what we were talking about with the soft fascination, you could really draw an analogy there to the problems of exercise, right? So you say, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to do... And we know that if you don't do that, then that might be bad for your physical well-being. Well, the same could be said here for, well, I intend to go out into the countryside next weekend, and then I don't. Well, if you're never going to eventually get out into the countryside, then you're not going to get that restoration that we know this can have. And it's really interesting to think that evolution... I'm going to struggle with the word
evolution,
too.
Yes.
In terms of
I'll look it up
in
afterwards.
terms of our kind of evolution, we do believe that people are hardwired to want to spend time outdoors. And it is interesting that our modern life is kind of preventing us doing that more and more.
The other thing I was reading in the same study was this idea of a hierarchy of outdoor space. I think we've got some volunteers near us who are chopping down a tree, I think. They'll shout timber any second, and we'll have to move out the way, Mike. We'll take cover, so we'll wait and see what happens. It also talked about a hierarchy of space, which I hadn't come across before. You know, people are drawn to water, they're drawn to the seaside, and as a hierarchy, seaside comes top. That's where people are drawn to most. And then inland water, and then where there's water and nature, which is where we are today. There's a lake here and there's woods here, and then nature after that. So there's kind of this hierarchy of need. And why should that be? And maybe it's just something inbuilt in us as humans, because, you know, if you go back through evolution, eventually we're back in the water, aren't we? We came from the seas, as it were, and maybe there's something that brings us back to water all the time. It's a really interesting idea.
It is, and you know, if you go back 20-30 years, the really key thing was green space, and what kind of green spaces are going to be available for people. And now there really is this concept of blue space. If you think about the sea, or you think about going to see a river or a lake, depending upon the time of year you go, and depending upon what the weather's like, that blue space looks so different. So you can get from visiting the same site, you can get very different kind of views and very different kind of aspects. But for some reason, I think people have this idea that there is going to be a greater variety around somewhere with blue space in terms of what they're going to see, albeit that they might be visiting the same site at different times of year.
You were saying earlier about soft fascination, there is that calming effect of the sound of water. There is something very calming about hearing the trickling of water or the sound of waves. It's a very calming effect. And here, actually, as I'm speaking, the sound of a bird.
Yeah, we're doing this very well, aren't we? That's been a couple of times now we've said it, and then a bird, like this time a bird's chirped up, right?
Mike, you work at University of East Anglia, but you're not actually, I think you've already mentioned, you're not actually from Norfolk or this part of the world, are you? Where are you from?
Yeah, so originally I grew up in Gloucestershire, on the English-Welsh border. So suddenly I had a shock when I first came here in 2007 to realise that there were no hills, which was, which was good for my legs, I suppose. And yes, I moved over in 2007 and never left.
Never left. You've been all this. Do you feel that you might stay? Actually, does this part of the world appeal to you?
It's very nice here, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, it's East Anglia is just a really really nice group of people, but really nice landscapes as well, right? It's just a very nice place.
You lecture in economics.
So I teach the first year students the very basics, and there's about 200 in those classes. So
Wow,
that's massive.
That's
numbers.
a large lecture.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Wow, when I went to university, which was a long time ago, 1986, I think there was only about 50 students at the most in one. And our smallest lecture actually probably had about 6.
Yeah, and so I'm closer to that I then take both undergraduate and postgraduate students in environmental economics, and those sort of numbers are between 30 and 40 students.
Yeah.
And that's also it's a big contrast, right? You can really sort of teach the stuff.
Yeah, it's more one-on-one almost.
Yeah, and you also teach the stuff that you're researching and you're kind of really familiar with.
Yes.
As opposed to teaching kind of textbook economics.
Yeah.
Maybe 5-6 years ago, I said to our head of school, I'd really like to start doing a module in environmental economics. We didn't offer it before that. And it's very small numbers to start with, and now it's one of the most popular courses we do, and I think there is a shift in young people really being very interested in sustainability and in environmental sciences, but also recognizing its place in economics itself. And economists are always sort of thought to always think about money and value of things, and now we're thinking, well, how do we value the environment? How do we make sure that we don't destroy the environment? And I think it's perhaps just very pleasing to see that kind of the younger generation have that in mind and are very wary about how we trade off kind of prosperity in a traditional sense of economics with prosperity in terms of what we have around us.
It's what you value, isn't it? How you measure value, in fact. It's like that thing about some countries. Is it Bhutan who don't have gross domestic product, they have gross domestic happiness as a measure of
we have various kind of rival indices to GDP growth. And another one is environmental performance. The Environmental Performance Index, which is something that looks at how sustainable is a country being in terms of its environmental output. And happiness indices as well. Where are the happiest places in the world?
Well, one of the happiest countries in the world is supposed to be Finland, and there's a town in Finland that was rated as the happiest town in Finland. So it's sort of renowned now as the happiest town in the world.
And there's a really interesting aspect to this, because there's a concept in economics known as the Easterlin paradox, and it's basically shown that over time we've got wealthier, but we haven't necessarily got any happier.
That's
and I think a lot of economists are starting to think, what do people really want to maximise? Do they want to make themselves as wealthy as possible? Of course, people like to have money.
Yes.
But aren't they also more concerned about being content?
Content, that's really interesting. And that's come up in another podcast episode, actually, is this idea of contentment being really the main driver, I think, in life, which is really important.
Yes.
You work in a place that is very green. It's interesting, UEA. We've been up there a few times to meet you at the Sainsbury's Centre and at your offices as well. And it's an incredibly green environment.
Yeah, we're really lucky. I mean, it's a campus uni, and the grounds it's got its own kind of man-made broad, and it's got forests, and it's got green space. And I think that is also really conducive for learning.
Yes.
I think it's quite nice that you have that opportunity to go and spend time out in a more rural environment.
Yes. Well, you were telling me earlier, weren't you, about how you did a lecture outside, didn't you? Was it thus a few years ago?
It was a couple of years ago. It was February, and it was about 20-25 degrees, which is unheard of.
Yeah, especially today.
And yes, we're in May, and it's definitely nowhere near that.
It's actually, we're only a week or so away from June, and it's only 12 degrees. So I'm not quite sure what's going on, but.
And I was teaching the environmental economics students. I went to the classroom and I said, right, pack up your things, we're going to do the lecture outside. So I did the lecture out in one of the kind of it's kind of like a little, I don't know what you call it, like a little amphitheatre. And it's very green, where I was doing it. And it was really interesting. We actually had people come and sit down who were nothing to do with the lecture and wanted to listen in.
Funny.
And one thing that happened, one of those students is now still at the university. And they said to me, that's the lecture I always remember. And actually, of everything we were talking about earlier, and in terms of, reflection and different environments and this kind of thing, it's perhaps very interesting and telling that that was what they remembered, because it was a break from their routine.
Mike, thanks so much for meeting us on the Suffolk Walking Festival podcast. Thank you for spending or giving up some of your time to talk to us about economic theory and how that relates to countryside access. It's been fascinating. We're still working together. We've got a 2-year project that we've just started, haven't we? So we're doing that for the next 2 years, researching again deeper into people's attitudes to going into the countryside and see how we can address some of those barriers that we talked about. It's been absolutely brilliant, been really fascinating. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, David. It's always a pleasure. So
thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.
And you back off to Norwich now?
Back off to Norwich, yes. It's just a little trip down the A11.
Well, I might go and get myself another latte.
That sounds like a good idea.
Brilliant. The Suffolk Walking Festival is one of the country's largest and longest running walking festivals. The festival takes place every May with over 100 walks and countryside events across the county. Visit suffolkwalkingfestival.co.uk for more information and follow us on Facebook for up-to-date news. Thank you to David Stainer and Scott Dolling of the duo Silbury Hill for the use of their music in this podcast.